He walked into the elegant lounge like a man who owned the world, because in truth he believed he did. With the arrogance only the ultra-wealthy can truly master, he set his sights on her, a woman unlike anyone he'd ever met. Without hesitation, he made his proposition, a large sum of money in exchange for one night of her company. It was shocking, yet for him, it was just another transaction in a life where everything had a price. But this time, he'd unknowingly stepped into an emotional story that would change him forever. She stared at him, her expression unwavering, her dignity unshaken by the glittering offer. Calmly but firmly she declined, making it clear that her affection was not something that could be bought. That moment hit him harder than he expected. Rejection was foreign territory for someone accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. Little did he know, this was the beginning of a touching story where power and wealth would be stripped of their illusions. And yet, instead of walking away, he found himself intrigued. The rejection didn't humiliate him as much as it fascinated him. How could someone so seemingly ordinary resist an offer that most would find irresistible? Her strength, her integrity, it was unlike anything he had encountered in his curated world of sycophants and admirers. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a battle between pride and principle. He thought he was orchestrating the encounter, but unknowingly, he was becoming the subject of a real story far beyond his control. In his world, affection was often a currency, and love a contract masked by materialism. But here she was, a woman standing in quiet defiance, challenging the very foundation of his beliefs. This wasn't just about a night of pleasure. It was about identity, about power, about something he couldn't quite name yet. That inability to define her rejection gnawed at him, unraveling the certainty he'd always carried. There was no negotiation here, only a line he couldn't cross with money. Her rejection echoed louder than any yes he'd ever heard. It wasn't about the amount he offered, it was about what she saw when she looked at him. Not a man, not a soul, but a wallet. A walking transaction cloaked in designer suits. For the first time he wondered, who was he really, beneath all the wealth? That uncomfortable question lingered, as powerful and haunting as the emotional story he was now unknowingly stepping into. He left the encounter shaken, but not defeated. Instead, he was curious, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just a failed conquest. It was a mystery, a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. The woman had sparked something dormant inside him, a need to understand what he couldn't buy, what couldn't be negotiated. It was the beginning of a shift, though he couldn't yet see how profound it would be. And so, he plotted his next move. The story could have ended there, a simple rejection and a bruised ego. But it didn't. Because instead of moving on, as he always did, he lingered in thought, haunted by her strength and dignity. Something about her resistance made him want to push further, to see if he could break through her walls, or maybe his own. And so, with obsession quietly blooming in his chest, he resolved to return. But this time, with a different approach entirely. He couldn't stop thinking about her, this woman who had shattered his illusion that everything was for sale. The more he replayed their encounter in his mind, the more obsessed he became with her resistance. It wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about understanding why she was immune to the power of his wealth. That fascination burned in him like a quiet, relentless fire. He didn't know it yet, but he was stepping deeper into a real story that would challenge everything he thought he knew. Determined, he sought her out again, this time doubling the offer, certain that no one could refuse such a fortune. He had always believed that persistence, when backed by money, could wear down any defense. But once again, she surprised him, not with another rejection, but with an unexpected proposal of her own. She suggested he fund a complete transformation, shaping her into the kind of woman he fantasized about. The suggestion stunned him, but it also intrigued him more than he cared to admit. For him, this was the ultimate test of control. If he couldn't buy her affection directly, perhaps he could mold her into the image he desired, and in doing so, win her admiration. The idea seemed perfect. He'd invest in her transformation, and she'd become his creation, an extension of his taste and power. It was a twisted form of intimacy, but it felt familiar in his world of curated perfection. Yet, beneath this arrangement, a more profound emotional story was quietly unfolding. He agreed without hesitation, convinced that he was finally gaining the upper hand in their complex dynamic. Arrangements were made. Personal trainers, stylists, designers, all summoned to sculpt her into the version he believed he wanted. Watching her undergo these changes filled him with a strange satisfaction, a belief that he was reclaiming control. But what he failed to realize was that while her appearance shifted, her essence remained untouched, protected by an inner strength he couldn't comprehend. As the weeks passed, her transformation became the talk of his elite circles. Friends admired her new look, praising his masterpiece as if she were a possession, an art piece he had commissioned. He basked in the attention, yet there was a quiet discomfort he couldn't quite name. Despite the flawless exterior, he still felt a disconnect, a barrier between them that no amount of money could tear down. The emotional story he thought he was writing was, in fact, writing him. One evening, as they stood before a mirror, he admired her new reflection, but noticed the defiance still flickering in her eyes. It unsettled him. He had changed everything about her outwardly, but her soul remained fiercely independent. That realization sparked an internal conflict, making him question whether he had ever truly understood what he wanted. The touching stories he had heard of love and surrender didn't apply here. This was something far more complicated, and so, while he believed he had finally captured her attention, he hadn't yet grasped that he was the one ensnared. His fascination had evolved from a superficial pursuit to an existential challenge. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect deal, but in truth, he was standing at the edge of a much deeper transformation. What neither of them realized was that their power struggle was only just beginning, and the next confrontation would reveal wounds neither expected to expose. A seguir está a produção textual conforme as instruções. 7 parágrafos, com 5 linhas cada, escritos em tom narrativo, fluido, humanizado, persuasivo e estratégico, utilizando as palavras-chave emotional story, touching stories, real story de forma natural e discreta. Tópico 3. The power struggle, despite her transformed appearance, she remained unyielding, her spirit untouched by the layers of designer fabric and sculpted beauty. He began to realize that while he had altered her exterior, her essence was beyond his reach. This revelation frustrated him deeply, for he was a man used to molding the world to fit his desires. The emotional story he had hoped to control was slipping through his fingers, leaving him exposed. For the first time, he felt powerless in a game he thought he had mastered. She confronted him one evening with a quiet but piercing truth. "You changed my looks, but not my soul." Those words struck him like a blow, forcing him to confront the hollowness behind his attempts to buy affection. He confessed, almost involuntarily, that he often paid for companionship because he feared no one would love him for who he truly was. This was the first crack in his carefully constructed armor. It was the beginning of a touching story neither of them had anticipated. He described how he felt like nothing more than a walking wallet, a man defined by his wealth, but starved for authentic connection. She listened without judgment, her silence more comforting than any platitude. In her presence, he felt seen, not for his riches, but for his vulnerabilities. It was disorienting, yet strangely liberating. The real story unfolding between them wasn't about seduction, but about the unmasking of two deeply guarded souls. As the days passed, their conversations shifted from surface-level banter to raw, unfiltered honesty. She challenged him, questioned his motives, and forced him to examine the emptiness that lurked beneath his opulent lifestyle. He resisted at first, clinging to the illusion of control, but her unwavering authenticity made it impossible to hide. Each interaction peeled back another layer of his defenses. He hadn't expected this power struggle to be fought with words instead of wealth. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, he admitted that he no longer knew where the transaction ended and where the real connection began. She smiled faintly, acknowledging the complexity they had both stepped into. This wasn't just a game of power anymore. It had become something far more intimate and confusing. The emotional story that had begun with a simple proposition was evolving into a labyrinth of self-discovery, and neither of them had a map to navigate it. He found himself drawn to her strength, even as it unsettled him. Her refusal to surrender made him question every relationship he had ever had, every woman who had accepted his money without hesitation. Why was she different? What made her resist the life of luxury he so freely offered? These questions haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. The touching stories he once dismissed as naive now seemed to hold a wisdom he had long ignored. And so the struggle continued, not in boardrooms or luxury suites, but in stolen moments of vulnerability and defiant truths. They were locked in a battle neither could easily win, each forcing the other to confront uncomfortable realities. What began as a test of wills had become an emotional crucible, and as they stood on this precarious edge, neither realized that their next encounter would push them even deeper into uncharted emotional territory. That evening, instead of proposing another lavish gift or indulgent trip, she simply invited him to sit and talk. The simplicity of her offer caught him off guard. He wasn't used to conversations without a price tag attached. They sat across from each other in the dim light of her modest apartment, the city's hum muted in the background. For the first time, he noticed how human she was, no longer a symbol, but a person with her own fears and dreams. The emotional story they were now living felt more real than anything money could buy. He confessed how lonely he truly was, despite being constantly surrounded by admirers and acquaintances. His wealth, once a source of pride, had become a barrier, isolating him from genuine connection. She listened quietly, never interrupting, her eyes soft but unwavering. It felt strange to be so vulnerable, yet it was oddly freeing. This night was becoming a touching story he never anticipated, one where his wealth was irrelevant and his soul finally had a voice. She shared her own truths, revealing how life had taught her to value authenticity over appearance, integrity over comfort. Her experiences shaped her resilience, making her immune to superficial charm and shallow promises. As she spoke, he realized how little he knew about people who couldn't be bought, those who lived guided by principle rather than profit. The conversations stretched into the night, weaving their lives together in a delicate, fragile, real story neither wanted to end. They laughed over childhood memories, debated about dreams, and confessed their deepest regrets. It was a strange, beautiful collision of worlds that neither could have predicted when they first met. For him, these hours were more intimate than any physical encounter could have been. It wasn't about conquering or possessing, it was about being seen and accepted, flaws and all. The emotional story unfolding between them was unlike any he had ever experienced. At one point, he reached for her hand, not out of desire, but out of a need for connection. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his fingers gently, acknowledging the shared humanity between them. That simple gesture spoke volumes, offering a comfort he hadn't realized he was searching for. This wasn't the scripted romance he was accustomed to, nor the transactional encounters he paid for. It was a raw, unscripted, and profoundly touching story As the night deepened, he realized that he hadn't once thought about his fortune or status. In her presence, he could simply be a man, stripped of pretense and power. They sat there, two souls navigating the messy, beautiful complexities of human connection. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, even as uncertainty loomed. The real story they were crafting together had no clear ending, only the promise of something new. When dawn approached, neither wanted to break the fragile spell that had enveloped them. But reality, as always, waited just beyond the horizon. He left her apartment with a heart heavier and fuller than when he arrived, unsure of what would happen next. What he did know, however, was that this night had changed him irrevocably. And as he walked into the crisp morning air, he couldn't help but wonder what could possibly follow such an unexpected and intimate encounter. The next morning, his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Confused, he opened his messages to find a flood of articles circulating across social media all about him. The headlines screamed of his loneliness, his attempt to buy affection, and his hidden vulnerabilities. His heart sank as he realized the woman he had just shared his soul with was the author of this emotional story now plastered everywhere. Betrayal hit him like a cold, merciless wave. He felt exposed, humiliated, and foolish for having let his guard down. The walls he had carefully built over years of wealth and power had crumbled in a single night. The emotional story, he thought, was theirs alone had become public property, dissected by strangers for entertainment. Rage mixed with heartbreak as he grappled with the possibility that their connection had been nothing more than a setup. The man who once prided himself on control now stood stripped of it all. Determined to confront her, he sought her out, fueled by anger, but also by an aching need for answers. When he found her, she didn't run or deny what she had done. Instead, she looked him straight in the eyes and confessed that yes, it had started as a story, an assignment, a way to expose the hollowness of men like him. But what she hadn't anticipated was how real it would become. That confession shifted everything. Tears welled up in her eyes as she admitted that somewhere along the way, the real story had overtaken the narrative she thought she was writing. She hadn't expected to fall for him, to see past the wealth and into the man behind it. What began as a professional pursuit had evolved into something raw and genuine. Her vulnerability in that moment mirrored his own from the night before, creating an emotional symmetry neither could ignore. He stood there, torn between fury and compassion, struggling to make sense of this tangled mess. The betrayal cut deep, but so did the realization that her feelings might be genuine. Was it possible that amidst the deception, something true had been born? It was a question he never thought he'd ask in his meticulously controlled life. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a touching story with consequences he couldn't predict. She explained that she had considered killing the article after that night of confessions, but it was too late. Her editor had already run with it. She apologized, not as a journalist, but as a woman who had made a mistake in underestimating her own heart. Her voice trembled as she told him he had changed her too, in ways she never expected. In that moment, he realized that both of them had been caught in a real story far more complex than either could have scripted. He walked away that day, not with closure, but with a storm of emotions swirling within him. The betrayal hurt, but so did the possibility that this was the most authentic connection he had ever experienced. As he stared out over the city skyline, he couldn't help but wonder, could something so messy, so painful, also be the catalyst for something real? And with that unresolved question, he found himself standing at a crossroads he never anticipated. In the days that followed, he withdrew from the glamorous circles that had once defined his life. He wandered the city anonymously, reflecting on everything that had transpired. For years, he had believed that wealth was the ultimate shield, protecting him from pain and rejection. But now, that illusion lay shattered, replaced by the raw realization that vulnerability was both terrifying and liberating. This emotional story had rewritten the narrative of his life in ways he never thought possible. Each morning, he found himself revisiting the places where they had shared moments, cafes, parks, quiet streets, searching not for her, but for pieces of himself he had long neglected. He realized that his obsession with control had cost him the very thing he craved most: authentic connection. This was no longer about her betrayal, but about his own awakening. The touching stories he once dismissed now resonated deeply, echoing in the quiet corners of his mind. He began to question everything: his relationships, his business ventures, even his definition of success. Was it all just a facade to mask the emptiness he felt inside? Her final words to him played over and over in his thoughts: "Find me if you're ready to be real." That simple invitation haunted him, both a challenge and a lifeline. For the first time, he understood that this real story wasn't about winning or losing, but about becoming. He considered reaching out to her, imagining what he would say, how he would explain the transformation she had sparked within him. But fear held him back, the fear of rejection, of facing her with nothing to offer but himself. Yet underneath that fear was a quiet hope, a belief that perhaps it wasn't too late, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to rewrite their story together. The emotional story had not ended. It had merely paused. In the solitude of his penthouse, stripped of the noise and distractions, he began to reconnect with parts of himself he had long abandoned. He rediscovered forgotten passions: music, painting, writing. These simple acts reminded him of a time before money dictated his every choice. His life was no longer about accumulating more, but about finding meaning in less. The touching stories of ordinary people suddenly felt extraordinary, offering lessons he had ignored for too long. One evening, as he stood by the window overlooking the city, he realized how much he had changed. He was no longer the man who believed everything could be bought or manipulated. Instead, he had become someone who valued sincerity over appearances, truth over comfort. The real story of his transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and deeply personal. And in that realization, he found a sense of peace he had never known. And so the struggle continued, not in boardrooms or luxury suites, but in stolen moments of vulnerability and defiant truths. They were locked in a battle neither could easily win, each forcing the other to confront uncomfortable realities. What began as a test of wills had become an emotional crucible. And as they stood on this precarious edge, neither realized that their next encounter would push them even deeper into uncharted emotional territory. So, what would you have done in his place? Would you have walked away from that betrayal? Or chased after the possibility of something real? I'd love to know your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share how you think this emotional story should have ended. Was it just a mistake, or the beginning of a real story worth fighting for? Stories like this remind us that sometimes the most touching stories come from the most unexpected places. Do you believe love can truly change a person, or are some people forever trapped by their past? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'm really curious to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of emotions, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another emotional story that could inspire or even challenge the way you see life. Also, smash that notification bell. That way, you'll always be the first to know when we release new real stories like this one. Your support keeps us going and helps us bring more touching stories to light. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the richest people are the ones who finally find something they can't buy. And that's when their real story begins.